Before climate models, before Greta Thunberg, before the term net zero even existed, there was a book, a river on fire, and one of the largest protests in United States history. This is the story of how environmental activism became a movement, and how all of that still shapes what activism looks like now. In 1962, marine biologist Rachel Carson published Silent Spring in response to the rise of synthetic chemicals like DDT. At the time, DDT is being marketed as a miracle. It's being sprayed on crops, in suburbs, and this is mostly due to the fact that it was wildly helpful during the Second World War to control lice and mosquitoes. However, its applications are being spread into suburban and urban areas. There are photos of trucks fogging city streets with the chemical while kids run through the mist like it's a water park. It was on every single urban surface imaginable. And Carson's whole point was that this was actually a horror story. These wonder chemicals didn't just kill mosquitoes, but they did so much more because of how indiscriminately they were applied. They contaminated streams, caused medical problems in children, and they thinned the eggshells of birds. The birds' eggshells were affected to the point that raptors and songbirds started disappearing. The silent in Silent Spring is literally a spring with no bird song left. And this book drops like a bomb. For the first time, millions of people are forced to connect this everyday product to invisible long-term damage. And it's not just, oh, it's happening somewhere else, but it's in your yard, your food, and your children's bodies. Silent Spring is considered to be the start of the modern environmental movement. It was a critique of the government's failure to protect public health and wildlife, and it pointed out that there were consequences. And this book wasn't published in a vacuum either. In 1969, there was a disaster along the California coast. A massive oil spill off of Santa Barbara coated the entire coastline in crude oil. Beaches were black, and thousands of birds and marine animals died. Around the same time, the Cuyahoga River in Ohio is so polluted with oil and chemicals that it literally catches fire. Again, the river was actually famous for being on fire all the time. It caught on fire at least 14 times, mostly due to all of the industrial pollution, and to the point that the Time magazine literally described it as a river that oozes instead of flows, and that people die not by drowning in it, but by decaying in it. So add in smoke so thick that you can see and taste it, asthma and cancer rates rising, and then suddenly this is a massive public concern. A lot of this was mostly in part due to the post-World War II consumerism and disposable lifestyles that had taken off. But this lifestyle was becoming increasingly less shiny and more toxic. People could see the haze, smell the water, and this was all physical, tangible things that they could see the effects of. So by the end of this decade, all of these incidents and Carson's book, and if you add that to Vietnam, civil rights, urban poverty, pollution, and nuclear fear, all of this tangled together results in a lot of anger and fear. And in 1970, all of that anger and concern finally consolidated into something organized. So enter Dennis Hayes. He is a 25-year-old grad student from Harvard who was recruited by Senator Gaylord Nelson to coordinate a national environmental teach-in. The plan at first was pretty modest. They were going to borrow tactics from the civil rights and anti-war movements and apply them to ecological issues. Hayes himself admits that he hoped to have maybe 8 or 10 cities. But on April 22nd, 1970, the turnout was not just 8 or 10 cities. More than 20 million people took place in Earth Day events, and they were essentially in every town and village and crossroads in America. And at the time, it's the largest single-day demonstration in United States history. In New York City itself, Fifth Avenue was completely closed to cars, and the rally stretched over 40 city blocks. Similar scenes played out in cities and small towns across the country. People were cleaning up rivers, holding teach-ins in school gyms, and kids were biking to the state capitol to protest smog. The message was very clear. Clean up the air, clean up the water, and protect the people. So why was Earth Day such a viral movement? Part of the reason is that people were finally connecting problems that they had previously felt were separate together. So topics such as dirty air, cancer, dead rivers, vanishing birds, these were no longer separate problems, but they were all seen as a shared crisis with common roots. How we produce energy, food, and stuff. Hayes himself recalls a moment in 1969, right before Earth Day happened, when the president of the National Audubon Society asked him, "What the hell does clean air have to do with birds?" A year later, nobody would have asked that question. Earth Day organizers helped pull all of these topics together. They framed pollution as a single shared crisis that cut across issues people already cared a lot about, like health, justice, war, and economic inequality. Some of these Earth Day speeches went even further, and they were openly radical. They connected environmental damage to poverty, racism, and the Vietnam War. This is powerful enough that corporations and politicians start realizing that this isn't just a bunch of kids out planting trees and frolicking in the park, but that they actually had an agenda, and they were a political movement with demands. And then almost immediately, this whole movement collides with geopolitics. Within weeks of Earth Day, President Richard Nixon orders troops to invade Cambodia. And days later, the Kent State shootings shocked the country. Environmental issues, which had briefly dominated the headlines, suddenly slipped back behind war and national trauma. But rather than giving up, Hayes and others decided to prove that environmental issues could swing elections. Hayes and the others launched a campaign against 12 pro-pollution members of Congress. They were lawmakers with bad environmental records in very vulnerable districts. They were known as the Dirty Dozen. With about $50,000, activists helped defeat 7 of the 12, including George Fallon, a powerful chair of the House Public Works Committee. And this gets Washington's attention, because once members of Congress saw that environmental issues could actually cost them their jobs, things started shifting. Less than a month later, Congress introduced the Clean Air Act, which passed the Senate unanimously. Other sweeping laws followed: the Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, Marine Mammal Protection Act, and more. And in 1970, the U.S. government created a new agency to enforce them, the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA. For roughly a decade, environmental policy was on the offense. Hayes described this period as one where environmental advocates were almost an unstoppable force. So at this time, climate change itself isn't exactly on the radar. Hayes says that around 1970, climate was something you might see in an occasional scientific paper mentioned alongside ideas like Snowball Earth. It wasn't exactly a public issue yet. The focus was still on smog and river and chemicals and wildlife. In the background, something bigger is quietly starting. By the time the EPA and Clean Air Act exist, scientists already know that pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere will warm the planet. That's 19th century physics. By the 1960s, even the industry kind of admitted it. A coal research group warned that if coal burning kept rising, the temperature of the Earth's atmosphere will increase and vast changes in the climate of the Earth will result, including melting ice caps and the flooding of coastal cities like New York and London. So the fossil fuel industry has known about this for decades. And the science isn't actually new, but what has changed is who's allowed to talk about it and how loudly. In response to increasing public awareness of the greenhouse effect, in the 70s, a conservative reaction starts to build up, starting to deny environmental concerns that could lead to more government regulation. At this time, President Jimmy Carter had set a goal of getting 20% of U.S. energy from renewables by 2000. And there was also something called the Solar Energy Research Institute, which was focused on how that might actually happen. At the time, the U.S. was actually fairly at the front of this possible clean energy transition. Solar cells were still clunky and expensive, but the path was technically there. And then the Reagan administration comes in. In 1981, the Department of Energy slashes the Solar Energy Research Institute's budget by almost $100 million, fires roughly a third of the staff, and cancels all of its contractors in one single hit. Hayes, who worked at the Solar Energy Research Institute, later called that one of the worst days of his life. And his takeaway was harsh. For the core technologies we still rely on, modern solar panels and wind turbines, the gap between what we could have built and what we actually built has been about 98% political versus technological. And because the US withdrew from this transition, other countries stepped in. Germany dedicated more subsidies towards a rooftop solar energy movement, and China started focusing on large-scale manufacturing, which sent the cost of solar panels from $70 per watt down to a fraction of $1. Then in 1983, the EPA also releases a report saying that global warming is not a theoretical problem, but a threat whose effects will be felt within a few years, with potentially catastrophic consequences. The Reagan administration publicly dismisses this as alarmist, and behind the scenes, there are also efforts to cut funding for climate research and even reduce carbon dioxide monitoring. Not because the science is weak, but because taking it seriously would mean a lot of changes in policy. And then climate change fully explodes into public view. In 1988, there are absolutely brutal heat waves, and at the same time, NASA scientist James Hansen testifies to Congress, saying with high confidence that global warming is underway and will likely bring more heat waves, storms, and floods in the future. So by the late 80s, there's a broad scientific consensus that the planet is warming, humans are burning fossil fuels, and that's one of the main causes, and that there will be serious consequences if we don't change course. You would think that that's the start of straightforward climate action. Instead, it's kind of the start of climate politics. The White House actually alters Hansen's testimony a bit, and there are even political cartoons depicting this moment, where they try to soften the message and language. There's other soft censorship as well. And then the Berlin Wall falls in 1989, and something interesting happens on the conservative side of US politics. A whole ecosystem of right-wing think tanks that had grown up during the Cold War to fight the Red Scare of socialism decide to pivot towards a new enemy after communism collapses: the Green Scare. Environmentalism, especially climate policy, starts getting framed as a threat to private property, free markets, and global capitalism. So rather than arguing that pollution is good, actually, these groups actually push environmental skepticism. Maybe biodiversity loss is exaggerated. Maybe climate models are overblown. Maybe regulation is more dangerous than warming. And the fossil fuel industry leans into this. In the 1990s, there's a coal-backed PR campaign that literally aims to, quote, reposition global warming as theory rather than fact. In 1998, the American Petroleum Institute circulates a plan to recruit friendly scientists and convince politicians, journalists, and the public that climate science is still too uncertain to justify serious regulation. So while the science is getting clearer, the public conversation is being deliberately muddied. At the same time, The world is trying to take steps towards actual policy. In 1987, the Montreal Protocol is signed to phase out chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, chemicals that originate from aerosols and refrigerants that have been created a giant hole in the ozone layer above Antarctica. People were concerned because a wider ozone hole could lead to skin cancer and UV damage, and this worked. The ozone hole is now healing, and the Montreal Protocol is being hailed as the golden standard for international climate cooperation. But then came the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, the first treaty that actually tried to tackle carbon emissions. It set binding targets, but the US never ratified it, and enforcement was rather weak. In 2015, the world tried again with the Paris Agreement. Every country agreed to limit warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, aiming for 1.5. But the targets were voluntary, and each country set its own nationally determined contributions. And the US kind of yo-yos. It leaves the Paris Agreement in 2020, rejoins a year later, and then exits. Again. But what was the cause of this? Most likely due to the change in administration. So by the 2000s, climate change in the US isn't just a scientific issue anymore, but it's a cultural war. Environmental protection laws go from being a bipartisan issue with unanimous votes to something that's more of a political fault line. Your opinions about carbon dioxide are now apparently being tangled up with your opinions on taxes, regulation, patriotism, and which news channel you watch. So here's where our first episode really leaves us. We started with visible pollution, burning rivers, smog, oil spills, and this is something concrete that was able to spark a real movement and real mass laws. That is why early environmentalism was so powerful. Organizers were able to point at the environment and ask people if they wanted their children to breathe this air and live in this environment. The stakes were immediate, and the political system could be pressured into acting. But now, with climate change, we are dealing with something that's more invisible. It's scientifically well understood, but it's just harder to get people to show up to a rally and try to convince them that doing so is going to change the amount of carbon dioxide that's being emitted by 200 nations around the world. And fossil fuel companies have known these risks for decades. But when the science gets too clear to ignore it, they don't suddenly flip and say, oh, you're right, let's shut that down. But they actually pivot. They start funding think tanks that actually cast doubt. They reframe the debate as uncertain science versus jobs and freedom. And they also nudge politicians to stall, censor, or just quietly water things down. And the result is that by the time you get to the 2010s, young people aren't just fighting climate change, but they're fighting decades of delay. And that is where we're going to be going next. In the next episode, I'm going to be diving into the fossil fuel playbook, how industries learn to manufacture doubt, greenwash their image, sponsor culture and politics, and how all of that sets the stage for the 2019 youth climate strikes and Gen Z's very different style of activism.